Okay, I want to welcome everybody to this morning's session, which is devoted to discussion of Rabbi Sachs's dialogue with general philosophy. Our first speaker will be Professor Daniel Reinhold. Daniel received his academic training at Cambridge and London universities in England. After lecturing for 6 years in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at King's College, he moved to the States, where he's now Dean and Professor of Jewish Philosophy at the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies. Daniel has published extensively on Jewish philosophy, most recently co-authoring a book entitled Nietzsche, Soloveitchik, and Contemporary Jewish Philosophy. In relation to this conference, it's also worth mentioning that Rabbi Sachs was a co-supervisor of Daniel's doctoral dissertation. Daniel.
Thank you very much, Tamara. I want to begin by just giving a little bit of context for my paper. So a question that I was almost always asked when participating in events following the passing of Rabbi Sachs was Jonathan Sachs a philosopher? And the question was asked in a manner that always seemed to me to imply that if I answered no, that was somehow to disparage his legacy. And that was an implication that I didn't really understand, because I'm not entirely sure why the title philosopher was deemed to be such an honorific for him, and I say this as a philosopher. Jonathan Sachs was, I think for most people, more a public intellectual than a philosopher in the professional sense. And without wishing to impugn anyone in the room, as such, had far more reach and influence than any of us in the academy ever will. As I often say, the rare copies of my books are the unsigned copies, whereby, in contrast, Professor Jonathan Reinhold, Professor Reinhold the Elder, my cousin, last night, presented very eloquently on the immense reach of Rabbi Sachs. So I find it genuinely mystifying quite why, as the question seemed to imply, being a philosopher would be considered a better use of Rabbi Sachs's time and talents. Having said that, Rabbi Sachs did, of course, have serious philosophical training. Now, by his own admission, and despite being one of the best-read people I've ever known, he didn't claim to keep up with the philosophical literature in the manner that an academician would, particularly after he became chief rabbi. I have a letter he wrote to me when I was just starting out my doctorate in 1994, where he pretty much says that explicitly. But with all that said, given his philosophical training, he most certainly utilized philosophy, presenting important philosophical ideas throughout his writings. A colleague of mine, David Schatz, has gone on record saying, and I quote, anyone who thinks well about philosophical issues is doing good philosophy. Educational degrees and canonical vocabularies are not the heart of philosophy. Maimonides didn't have a PhD, close quote. Now, I happen to agree with David's general assessment, but, of course, Rabbi Sachs did have a PhD in serious philosophical training, so it strikes me that regardless of what I have just said, we nonetheless can and should analyse Rabbi Sachs's use of philosophy when he does use it in the service of the arguments and ideas that he presents. So this paper is an attempt to analyse one such use. It's his use of the concept of the self. It's something that he invokes throughout his writings, sometimes to great effect, and at other times in a manner that's maybe more problematic. So this is less about Rabbi Sachs's philosophy and more a kind of meta-reflection on his use of philosophy, and presented in the belief that there are important ideas that can be mined from his work, but it's not always the case that in his writings philosophy is in the driver's seat. So, that said, so Rabbi Sachs famously presents his conception of selfhood that in terms of his own influences owes much to communitarian critiques of the liberal conception of the self as unencumbered, a conception that's foundational to John Rawls's magisterial and highly influential work, Theory of Justice. That's second shout out for Rawls today, following Hanoch. So the self, on Rawls's view, is fully formed, at the very least, as a locus of moral and indeed rational choice, prior to any network of commitments or relationships into which it may subsequently place itself. I'll elaborate a bit to make clear. So to quote Michael Sandel, Rawls portrays the self as prior to and independent of purposes and ends. So the self has a unity, a metaphysical reality, that precedes its commitment to any ends, and its moral worth, the moral worth of the self, is independent of those ends, which are the result of the self's autonomous choices. Right? So to cite Sandel once more, the Rawlsian liberal view is one that maintains a distinction between the values that I have and the person that I am, such that we're metaphysically constituted as selves prior to our choosing those ends. Right? And it's in our capacity for choice that we find our moral agency. As Alistair MacIntyre puts it, to be a moral agent is, on this view, precisely to be able to stand back from any and every situation in which one is involved, from any and every characteristic that one may possess, and to pass judgment on it from a purely universal and abstract point of view that is detached from all social particularity. Close quote. So in summary, the person I am and the locus of moral worth is a featureless, and therefore the claim might go unbiased, purely rational chooser that's constituted as a self prior to any of the choices I go on to make. Now, Rabbi Sacks, in contrast, follows Sandel and MacIntyre in the belief that this view of selfhood profoundly misunderstands what it is to be a self, and by implication, the nature of moral agency and practical rationality. For them, the self is encumbered rather than unencumbered. And one of the main points of difference, and it emerges nicely from a quote taken from Bernard Williams, again, following Hanoch's mention of him. This is one of the places where Sacks actually agreed with Williams. So Williams, when he's critiquing utilitarianism, in the course of that, he writes the following. He says that a person is identified with his actions as flowing from projects and attitudes which in some cases he takes seriously at the deepest level as what his life is about, or in some cases this section of his life. It's absurd to demand of such a man that he should just step aside from his own projects and decisions and acknowledge the decision which utilitarian calculation requires. It's to alienate him in a real sense from his actions and the source of his action in his own convictions. So the point is that to see the self as this unencumbered atomistic chooser is to misunderstand the relationship we have to our most deeply held commitments, those that in a certain sense of the word maybe define us, right? There are ends that aren't simply related to us as interests that we happen to possess or have chosen, but that are integral to our very identity, right? So, and as such, the idea of having a self, individuating the self prior to our relation to our ends makes no sense, because there are some ends that constitute our selfhood. And to disrupt those ends could genuinely undermine our sense of selfhood if they're that central to who we are. This is actually related to a further characteristic of the unencumbered atomistic notion of selfhood proffered by Rawls, which this communitarian conception rejects. And that's the Rawlsian conception is highly voluntaristic, right? All of our ends are chosen. And choice, independent of any ends, right, is the fundamental feature of the unencumbered self. So for Rawls, all of my values are attached to me via acts of will. I just choose from the menu with which life presents me. And of course, if all of our ends are chosen by acts of will in that way, no end can constitute the self, right? Because the self always has to pre-exist in order to choose them. So, an important point to emphasize here is that these choices are not only seen by Rawls as contingencies that are inessential to who I am, to my selfhood, but also as obfuscating genuine rational judgment, which ought not to be prejudiced by such contingencies as, for example, the circumstances of one's birth. One ought to stand back from these in order to make neutral, rational judgments. So for MacIntyre, in contrast, that kind of criterionless choice, unencumbered by any sense of personal identity, is an arbitrary choice, right? As he puts it, without our moral particularities to begin from, there would never be anywhere to begin. Right? So rational choice is based on reasons, and some reasons are better than others precisely because of our encumbrances, or to use the favoured terminology of MacIntyre Sachs, the narratives that give structure to our sense of self. Acting in a manner that ignores those narratives can be deeply problematic. Mrs. Jellyby from Charles Dickens's Bleak House is an off-cited paradigm here, philanthropist so dedicated to her African causes that she wrecks lives within her own family, right? And most importantly, intuitively, I think it seems to many of us that the mere accident of birth that makes her family actually gives her a very good reason to give them preferential treatment. Now, what matters for our purposes here is that Rabbi Sachs believes that the communitarian picture of the self that we kind of very briefly outlined is the Jewish picture of the self, right? Written into the very nature of Judaism. As Rabbi Sachs puts it, I quote, "A Jew is a Jew by virtue of birth. And this fact carries with it certain duties and obligations. Membership of the Jewish community is thus simultaneously a biological and ethical proposition. Jews do not choose the commands by which they are bound." Right? So point being, we are for Judaism, with the honourable exception of converts, defined by a matter not of our choosing, but by the contingency of those to whom we are born. So that, as Rabbi Sachs writes elsewhere, "I'm a Jew because, knowing the story of my people, I hear their call to write the next chapter. I did not come from nowhere. I have a past, and if any past commands anyone, this past commands me." So, Rabbi Sachs argues Judaism rejects the voluntaristic idea that all of our values are essentially chosen. In Judaism, there are values and obligations that are given as an accident of birth. Moreover, that Jewish identity is one that's not a simple interest I have among others, right? It's felt by many, whether religious or secular, to define their very sense of self. So for Rabbi Sachs, the idea of the unencumbered self, a conception of selfhood he believes to be a symbol of modernity that's become deeply entrenched in specific forms of modern liberalism. Note, not classical liberalism, of which Sachs himself was an advocate. And that's not a view of the self that can be countenanced by Judaism. Right? Rabbi Sachs's point is that Judaism presents us with a view of personhood whereby we're essentially situated, with our identities tied to the encumbrances that define us. It is to know, as Sandel put it, that I move in a history I neither summon nor command, which carries consequences nonetheless for my choices and conduct. Okay, so far so communitarian. And I would add, agree or disagree, there's no question that one can make a strong case along the lines that Rabbi Sachs presents regarding this being a more Jewish view of the self. And it's a view that runs through his thought for the duration of his career. However, issues arise with Rabbi Sachs's subsequent use of this conception of selfhood, particularly in what I think was his first book as chief rabbi, One People, subtitled Tradition, Modernity and Jewish Unity. As the subtitle implies, the book was dealing with what was then the issue du jour, Jewish unity. In particular, that between different Jewish denominations in the UK, and Miri in her paper kind of referred to this in as much as, the chief rabbi is an appointee of the United Synagogue, a centrist Orthodox movement, but de facto is seen, at the very least by non-Jewish British institutions, governmental and otherwise, as a spokesperson for Anglo-Jewry, which can clearly cause discomfort for the UK's conservative, reform and liberal communities. Now, following a number of communal flashpoints, Rabbi Sachs wrote this book to address Jewish denominational unity. And the picture he presented in the work was one that he termed inclusivism, which, to cite his own words, I quote, involves a denial of truth to secular and liberal Judaisms, much as these Judaisms involve a denial of truth to orthodoxy. But it insists that secular and liberal Jews are part of the covenant, participant in Judaism's binds of collective responsibility to be related to with love, dignity, and respect. This offends the modern self, which demands to be respected not for what it is, but for what it believes and does, close quote. Now, without getting into the rights and wrongs of the view itself, it's worth noting that in order to justify this idea of inclusivism, Rabbi Sacks invoked a number of Talmudic ideas, minhag avotehem v'yadehem, right, that you're carrying on the minhagim, the customs of one's ancestors, and tinok shenishba, child raised among Gentiles, and that it's because of those, right, because of those ideas, that enables Rabbi Sacks to treat what he sees as his words, heresy of the liberal Jew as inherited, not chosen. Right? So kind of Jews of these denominations inherit that, they don't choose that, because they are either, it's either tinok shenishba, minhag avotehem v'yadehem. To quote the way he puts it, the method of inclusivism is considered as a formal halachic device to isolate the liberal or secular Jew from his beliefs. The beliefs remain heretical, but those who believe them are not heretics, for they do not ultimately or culpably believe them. Liberal and secular Jews remain Jews, even though neither liberal nor secular Judaism is Judaism, close quote. Now, unsurprisingly, Rabbi Sacks incurred the wrath of non-Orthodox denominations when this work was published, much as he incurred the wrath of many Orthodox Jews almost a decade later with the dignity of difference. Who would be chief rabbi. Now, it's worth just a couple of qualifications here before I take this forward. First, regardless of what one thinks of his approach here, Rabbi Sacks generally maintained very respectful and cooperative working relationships with non-Orthodox leaders and communities during his chief rabbinate. Second, albeit similarly, I'm interested here in his work from a conceptual perspective, so I'm less interested in rehearsing the pros and cons of inclusivism itself, and more in what appears to me to be conceptual problems that arise for it. And these problems focus precisely on how he factors his conception of selfhood into the inclusivist equation. Right? So if we reconstruct his proposal regarding how to deal with this problem of Jewish unity, we find the following. Right? Number one, as we've seen, Rabbi Sacks clearly presents the communitarian encumbered view of the self as the Jewish view, right? First part of the paper. Number two, Rabbi Sacks then attacks liberal Judaism for affirming the autonomous self, right? The kind of more Rawlsian view of the self, which he claims is what leads them astray. And the quote where this is most clear, he writes, liberal Jew wishes orthodoxy to respect the integrity of his abandonment of tradition. We've seen that integrity, in the sense in which he uses the word, as the affirmation of the autonomous self, cannot be admitted as a virtue within the halachic system. Here we are faced with an irresolvable conflict between traditional and modern consciousness, close quote. All right? So, he invokes a view of the self as uncumbered as the Jewish view, and then within liberal and kind of liberal progressive forms of Judaism, he accuses them of, in effect, acting out as autonomous selves rather than encumbered selves. Okay. Number three, the problem. Rabbi Sacks then pulls a tactic straight from the autonomous self's playbook, because he defines liberal Jews by abstracting away their encumbrances through the use of minhag avotehem v'yadehem tinok shenishba, yielding inclusivism. Right? So once more, what is it? It's a formal halachic device to isolate liberal or secular Jew from his beliefs. Right? That's the method here. And, as he puts it elsewhere, the reason he can do that, why can he abstract away these things? Because, as he puts it, inclusivism involves seeing the heresy concerned as inherited, not chosen. Right? So Rabbi Sacks' strategy here is to divest his fellow Jews of some of their most central values and ends, those that may provide the very foundation of their Jewish identity. Moreover, he does so on the basis of the values being inherited, right? Not chosen. So inclusivism requires that he define non-Orthodox Jew in a manner that ignores their inherited values precisely because they're only inherited. We couldn't ignore them that way if they'd been chosen. But the problem is Rabbi Sacks has previously presented the communitarian view of the self as the Jewish view. And that view specifically argues that we ought to privilege the values that are inherited over those that are chosen. Right? So the communitarian view cuts against the idea that the values that most define us are those that are chosen, an idea that Sacks holds to be definitive of the modern view of the self. So, when it's precisely those ends that are not chosen, that are inherited, that he strips away from liberal Jews to define them as Jews, it seems he's only able to maintain Jewish unity by denuding liberal Jews of their selfhood, which in turn he can only do by utilising the very theory of selfhood that he denies. So, Sacks's inclusivism therefore demands that when it comes to his liberal brethren, we ignore the Jewish view of the self and invoke the modern one. And to cite Williams once again, however, it's absurd to demand of such a man he should step aside from his own projects and decisions. So what Rabbi Sacks here is demanding is the absurd approach. Williams does go on to say that this is an attack on a person's integrity, and one of the main critiques of Rabbi Sacks on this was that it impugned their integrity, and he does respond to that very sensitively. He's not unaware of that, obviously. And notably at this very institution, the conversation he had with Amos Oz that was referred to a couple of times last night, Amos Oz challenged Rabbi Sacks on this very point, saying that Tinok Shenishba can't serve as the basis for a mutually respectful dialogue between Orthodox and secular Jews. Putting that to one side to summarise, it seems to me there are two problems that emerge out of Rabbi Sacks's use of the communitarian theory of the self. First, most importantly, regarding his use of philosophy, there's this internal inconsistency that I've just outlined. He utilises a view of the self that he absolutely rejects in order to maintain unity between Orthodox and liberal Jews. So he can only maintain that unity through the use of, in his view, a false, more than that, anti-Jewish view of selfhood. So if anything, it's Sacks who's asking Orthodoxy to use non-Jewish and his way of thinking false views of selfhood in order to divest liberal Jews of their most deeply held Jewish beliefs. A second, more substantive question is whether it's really the case that the liberal Jew is trading on an affirmation of the autonomous self, because they're not discarding their encumbrances. They're strongly identifying as Jews, as liberal Jews. For Sacks, after all, they have inherited rather than chosen their rejection of Orthodox halakha. So interestingly, there's an alternative strategy for a liberal response to Rabbi Sacks's inclusivism would actually be to not balk at his description and say, how dare you say these are inherited and not chosen, but to welcome it. Say, yes, they're inherited, and you say that those are the things that are most privileged and that we should care about the most in terms of the self. So an alternative way to respond. But regardless of the strategy of response, what's most interesting to me is that it might be that the whole question of selfhood here is actually a red herring, right? Because I don't think it's the case that anyone, right, and here particularly kind of liberal Jews, maintain a mistaken conception of selfhood, right? Communitarians generally argue that the Rawlsian picture of the self is false, if not incoherent. Right? Moral agency can only be modelled on the communitarian conception. So whether we recognise it or not, we are all communitarian selves. And that would mean that liberal Jews are identified as much by their encumbrances as any of us. In fact, Rabbi Sacks himself often acknowledges this when he invokes Rabbi Soloveitchik's distinction between Brit Goral, covenant of fate, and Brit Yud, covenant of destiny. So Jews of all denominations are Jews precisely because of the covenant of fate, sealed in Egypt, such that regardless of halachic commitment in Rabbi Sacks's summation of the idea, there's a sense that Jews have of shared history, of collective emotional involvement in Jewish suffering, mutual responsibility, collective action to improve the material situation of Jews. So with this, it seems, he's acknowledging that all Jews are encumbered. And this, it further seems, is the foundation of our Jewish identity, or at least Jewish personhood. So this Brit Goral yields a sense of self in the very way the communitarian view dictates. So the real point that emerges from the above is that, in truth, Sachs's issue with liberal Judaism has little to do with conceptions of selfhood and more to do with the subsequent choices that encumbered Jewish selves make when they identify with a version of the Jewish narrative that departs in significant ways from his own. That is, departs from commitment to halachic obligations that he sees as the Brit Yud. So it seems as if the real disagreement here is over which values ought to be most authoritative, given that we all define ourselves and are encumbered with the givenness of our Jewish identity. So Rabbi Sachs's contention might be that liberal Jews are so entrenched within modern liberalism that they've located themselves within that narrative to the exclusion of the Jewish one. But of course, there are elements within orthodoxy who aimed the very same criticism at him during the dignity of difference furore. So might it instead just be that liberal Jews are negotiating the very same tensions that he is, but in a different way? And is not some such negotiation inevitable for all communities? No community is an island. Rabbi Sachs, as an Orthodox Jew, also committed to the basic values of the liberal democracies of which he was a product, negotiates the two in one way, his liberal brethren in another. So the real debate here is not about whether there are certain givens which are inherited and not chosen that provide us with criteria to make rational, meaningful choices. It's rather about whether any of those givens must be authoritative and placed beyond critical reflection or revision. And while Rabbi Sachs, qua Orthodox Jew, believes halachic commitment falls within that category, not up for replacement, others disagree. But the disagreement isn't over the nature of selfhood or the importance of our encumbrances. So, to conclude, to my mind, what's presented by Rabbi Sachs in terms of philosophical conceptions of the self devolves into an intra-religious debate. As Sam Liebens writes in a recent piece on Rabbi Sachs's thoughts, such disagreements between Jews are in-house and intra-linguistic. And whether there are arguments that can be made for preferring one denomination over another is an open question. It might be fine-grained philosophical analysis can contribute to that, maybe not. But either way, conceptions of the self aren't the place to look for those arguments. So, in this case, a closer look at the philosophy reveals that Rabbi Sachs's argument is not moored to the philosophical issue upon which he tries to base it, that of selfhood. The point at issue turned out to be less philosophical than theologico-political. And what's interesting, however, and here at last we encounter the pragmatism of my title, is that when I presented an earlier iteration of this, I was asked whether Rabbi Sachs ever revised his inclusivist view following the criticism he received for it. And the answer that I gave then, though I'm happy to be corrected if anyone knows differently, is that to my knowledge he never returned to it or really spoke of it again. He was fond of quoting the Elie Wiesel aphorism, Judaism has its silences, but we don't talk about them. And it seems as if this was then one of his. But it strikes me as significant because it seems to me that Rabbi Sachs utilized philosophical ideas for pragmatic reasons to illustrate in an illuminating way points that were intended to be for the good of the Jewish people. And whether he necessarily paid careful attention to tracking the manner in which the tentacles of those views spread beyond his immediate pragmatic concern is more open to question. So in this instance, what mattered most was less philosophical consistency between different uses of the self and more the pressing problem of Jewish unity that he encountered. And whether one agreed with his inclusivism or not, it was employed in his own words as a formal halachic device to achieve an end that he deemed important. And if in the background he also employs a theory of the self and does so inconsistently, I would submit this was of less import to him. So if he failed to present a way of unifying Jews that was acceptable to those in other denominations, that's maybe less significant than what his desire to do this at all reflects, and his subsequent decision to not speak of it again once it hadn't worked out. And as Elliot Sachs actually wrote to me on this, Rabbi Sachs likely would have said, look to the purpose, not the mechanics. And so, to return to my starting point, being a philosopher in the academy brings certain things to the table, maybe automatically places one in a community where we can plug into critical feedback loops that help us refine our work and maybe gain greater precision and clarity. And that kind of feedback loop might not always be available to somebody not working directly in the field. With Rabbi Sacks, there's the added complication of being the public face of the UK Jewish community, where he swiftly learned the old adage about not being able to please all the people all the time. And while he expressed some very important ideas in a public forum, the pragmatic navigation of these theologico-political tensions was never far from the surface. In fact, they, rather than philosophical niceties, were likely at the very forefront of his mind. But it's important that they should be for somebody in his position. So ultimately, it's not really a critique. Thank you.